Hey everyone, in my last video I talked about chord transitions and the easiest way to get from one chord to another. Today I'd like to talk about the chords themselves and how to put them together. So let's dive in. I'm going to start with these examples. They're going to be in the root of C. So we'll start with real basic, a C major sound. So if you know about the modes, the chords that come out of those scales using the arpeggios, this will be a little bit easier. If you don't, we're going to talk about modes at a later point. But for right now, we'll just get the finger shapes, and we'll go more into the theory behind them later on. So for this first chord, like I said, C major sound, I'm going to start with my second finger. I'm on the C. Then I have a major third and an octave. So I'm playing the major third with my first finger, playing the octave with my pinky. Gives me a 1 finger per fret spacing. Pretty comfortable for me to play. Simple to get all those notes out. I can arc my finger over the strings so that I'm not muting anything. All 3 of those notes can ring out at the same time. Because otherwise I'm just making an arpeggio if it's just one note at a time. But if I'm playing them all at the same time, now I'm getting a chord. So what I want to show you is kind of how that chord came up. It's just this shape, right? But it came out of a C major scale. So that's that old do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scale. Most of you have heard that scale before. You know what it is. If you're not, again, if you're not familiar with the theory behind it, we'll dig into it a little bit later on. So I'm taking that first note, the third note of the scale, and then I'm taking the last note, which is just an octave of the first, which is a C. So typically a C major chord will be made up of the first note of the scale, the third note of the scale, and the fifth note. So I can play that. First note, third note, fifth note. And we may be familiar with that as bass players, as it's a basis of blues patterns, old rock and roll kind of stuff. That kind of sound. So we may be familiar with that shape and playing that as an arpeggio or as a bass line against the chord. If you put all those together, you get that C major chord. So I typically leave out the fifth of chords. The fifth is kind of filling out the sound. It doesn't give you much more than fattening up the sound. So because we're playing on bass, we have these heavy strings. We're already getting a pretty fat sound to begin with. So I will drop the fifth so it doesn't sound too dense. By putting that octave in there, it kind of lightens it up. But it depends on the sound I'm going for. If I'm playing a song that I want it to sound a little bit darker, a little bit heavier, I might play it like that. But this is just a common way that I play this C major. So the cool thing about learning these chords as shapes is you can take the shape and move it around. So again, my root note, the C, is played with my second finger. So if I look at the distance between my fingers and how I'm moving across strings and frets, keep that exact same shape, and I move that around. So if I take it up a whole step or 2 frets, now I'm playing a D major. Take it up another couple of frets or a whole step, playing an E major. Now I don't necessarily have to know the notes that are in an E major to play an E major. I can think of the shape and just find my E and then play that shape, and now I have that chord. So E major, D major, C major. I'm not really thinking about the notes, I'm just thinking about the shape and where the root is at. Now ideally I'm going to want to know what those letter name notes are. It helps me in communication with other musicians, helps me if I want to write down an idea. But knowing them as a pattern is a great place to start, because you can go back, and as you play that pattern, you can then figure out what the letter name notes are. You don't have to know them first, then find them on the neck. You can play the shape, and then if you need to know the letter name notes, Again, to talk to another musician, you can do that easily by just going through the pattern. So that's the way I think about all my chords, is just finger shapes. Makes it much quicker. So that's one of my favorite ways to play a major sound. To make this into a minor, one simple movement. I'm going to take my first finger, it's playing that major third. All I have to do is lower it down one fret, and I get a minor third. That gives me C minor sound. Again, I could play that with the fifth if I wanted it to be even darker. So C major, C minor, C major, C minor. Just that little transition. Again, the same thing. If I want to go up and play a D, I have the D major or D minor. Now, if you know your modes and you know how those arpeggios come out of the modes, you can start putting things together in a particular key. So if it was in the key of C major and the root note of the chord changed to a D, it would be a D minor in order to stay in that same key. And then same thing, if I went to an E, it would be an E minor. And then if I went to an F, it'd be back to a major. And you can hear how that makes sense. Musically, it makes sense. Like, you know kind of where it's going. Because it's all staying relative to the key of C major. So it's really good to know the modes and how they work. Knowing your theory is going to help you to put this stuff together. So again, that all just makes sense because it is in that one key. So you could take these chords and put them in almost any order. And it just all makes sense. I'm just randomly going through chords, but because they're in the same key, they make sense together. So that's why knowing that theory is so important. It's such a quick way to get to playing something musical. So a couple other chords that I like to do, and again, I'm basing these on shapes. Sometimes I do inversions of chords, depending on where I'm playing them, to get different kinds of sound. So again, I showed you a couple of different ways of playing that major, right? So I got the root, the major third, and then octave. The root, the major third, and the fifth. I can play that root, major third, and fifth, but I can play it in a kind of a different way. So I could play the root, again, I'm still playing a C. I'm just playing it in a different spot. And I can play that major third, and instead of playing the fifth up here, I can play it an octave lower. So when I voice that chord, I'm starting the lowest note that I'm playing is the fifth. Then I play the root of the C, and then the major third. Now that gives me a different tonality. Same three letter name notes that are found here in my C major here. But you can hear the tonality, the difference of that, right? It's a heavier sound, it's a little darker sound, even though it's a major chord, it's a little more somber sounding. You put your own words to it on how you describe that. It's the same three letter name notes, but that different voicing can give you a different mood. And so you now have a couple of options of what you can play when you want a major sound. You could play that 1-3 octave, you play the 1-3-5, play the 5-1-3, you could play a 3-5-1, however you want to put them together. You could space them apart more by using open strings or maybe two-handed tapping to kind of stretch that chord out amongst the neck rather than grouping them all tightly together like what I'm doing right now. You can just experiment with that. So again, that major, 1-3-5, 1-5-3, and then remember how I showed up here that making it from a major to a minor was just taking that minor third down. Same thing I can do for these other shapes, right? So the 1-3-5 with the major third, I can lower that to 1 minor third now and a 5. Still keeping 1 finger per fret, and I'm, instead of using my third finger for the major third, I'm now using my second finger for the major third. Same thing with this shape down here where I had the 5 on the bottom, the 5, 1, 3. If I want to make it minor, I'm just taking that down 1 fret. And then the same thing of how I showed up here. To stay relative to my key, I have to change between the major and the minor. I can do that same thing down here. But it gives me different tonalities. So again, I may choose those depending on what I'm trying to express. So those were simpler chords, 1-3 or 1-3-5. So in certain types of music, you're going to hear something that's just a little bit bigger or more expansive kind of a chord, which would be a 1-3-5-7. So when I express those, again, I like to drop out the fifth because all it's doing is fattening up the chord from my perspective on bass. So I drop out the fifth a lot of times, and what I'll end up playing is the 1-3-7. So going back to our C shape that we started with, major, the root, the major third, and the octave, or the root, the major third, and the fifth. Again, I'm going to drop that fifth out. And now when I think of my major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I know where I want to play at. So 1, 3, 5, 7. And that gives me kind of a cool, it has sort of a jazzy sound depending on how you play it. But it's just a nice, and we already learned the 1-3 octave, right? So we can kind of move around in between that octave with playing that with our pinky, and then going down to the major 7, playing that with our third finger, still 1 finger per fret. You get some cool sounds with very little effort, very little movement. So kind of fun. Again, if we're staying within our key, we're going to have to move the 7th around like we did our third. So when we were originally playing the 1-3 in the octave, we had C major to stay in the key of C major. We had C major, D minor, E minor, F major. So now if I put the 7th in against all those chords, we'll have a C major 7, a D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7. And then if we kept going, we'd have a G dominant 7. And if you hear that chord, you might recognize that kind of sound. That's a real bluesy sort of sound. So you're probably used to hearing things like that kind of thing. That's a dominant 7 sound. Those are those kinds of we're usually playing bass lines, something like that around those chords. 1, 3, 7. So our 7th is a minor 7. Instead of being up here, we're just playing 1 fret down. But that gives us that cool bluesy sound. So again, those are some of my favorite chords. They're pretty simple. I'm also going to, in the comments below this video, I'm going to attach a printout or a picture of these chord voicings and some different ones that we didn't talk about. Let me know in the comments what you think, if you like where I'm going with these topics, if you want to talk about anything different. But feel free to comment, feel free to share these things. I love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear what direction you want to go in next. This is all conversational, so it's fun to hear what you guys think, and maybe even be able to help you guys if you're struggling with anything, and maybe you can help me on some of the stuff that I struggle with too. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.